I'm so thrilled to see so many of you here, and I know there's many people online to celebrate my wonderful colleague Julie Stone Peters' book, Staging Witchcraft Before the Law, which, by the way, is available outside. My role really is moderator here, so I am just going to start by welcoming our panelists as briefly as possible so that we can get to the main event. Julie Stone Peters is the H. Gordon Garbedian Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia. She's also an affiliated faculty member at Columbia Law School and a global professorial fellow at Queen Mary University School of Law in London. Her most recent books are the wonderful Staging Witchcraft Before the Law, Skepticism, Performance as Proof, and Law as Magic in Early Modern Witch Trials, and Law as Performance, Theatricality, Spectatorship, and the Making of Law in Ancient, Medieval, and Early Modern Europe. She's also the author of a recent piece in the Chronicle called We're Demanding Way Too Many Documents from Job Candidates. She wrote in part as her role as careers advisor here at Columbia. We're joined by Julie Crawford, Associate Director of Graduate Studies, and Mark Van Doren, Professor of Humanities, who works on 16th and 17th century English literature and culture. She has written on Shakespeare, John Fletcher, Margaret Cavendish, the Sidneys, Anne Clifford, Margaret Hoby, and Mary Roth, as well as on post-Reformation religious culture, the history of reading, and the history of sexuality. Next is Rivka Galchen, an award-winning fiction writer and journalist whose work appears often in The New Yorker, Harper's, the London Review of Books, and The New York Times. She's the author of 4 books, Atmospheric Disturbances, American Innovations, Little Labors, and her latest, Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch. And then we have Sarah or Sally Beringer-Gordon, the Arlen M. Adams Professor of Constitutional Law and Professor of History Emerita at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. She's best known for her work on religion and American public life and the law of church and state, especially for the ways that religious liberty developed over the course of American national history. Please join me in welcoming and congratulating Julie Stone Peters, who will start us off today.
Thank you, everyone. And I don't know if it's witchcraft that conjured everybody here, or I suspect it's my 3 panelists. I want to start by telling you about one of the cases that I talk about to sort of plunge you into the middle of the book. And I promise I will get to the more academic stuff later, if maybe. Anyway, so 1591, we're in Louviers, France, where a genteel family has moved into a haunted house. Oh, you are? All right. Well, you'll get it twice. We should have talked. The family's heard an evil spirit in the back rooms that's moaning and cooing and sometimes appearing in the form of a pigeon. And one day it comes down the chimney like a brand of fire, and it overturns chairs and it breaks dishes and it leaves its ghostly white demon droppings everywhere. And everyone says, obviously, witchcraft. So they arrest a suspect, Françoise Fontaine, who's a 22-year-old servant who's been behaving very oddly. And everyone says she's got to be guilty. And that is everyone except the royal magistrate, whose name is Lois Morel. Who takes the case in hand and essentially records every detail in the trial record as the trial is going on. And this is not for publication. This is not a sensational pamphlet. He really believes that he's seeing absolutely everything that he records. So he's skeptical. He really doubts that witchcraft is behind it, but strange things start to happen in the courtroom. Françoise starts to thrash on the ground violently. She twists her arms and legs, her eyes pop out, her hair stands on end. And Morel has to say, okay, probably it's witchcraft, but is she a witch or is she a victim? So he's going to put the question to a test. So he starts by gathering his fellow judges and they decide to recite the Gospel of John, which he says has a great deal of power against devils. But he writes, for fear that the accused Françoise would perceive what we were about to do, we covered our faces with our cloaks to just below the eyes, and approached her. So there's this marching phalanx of chanting judges, cloaked up to the eyes, crossing themselves before and behind. I don't know how to do that. As they approach, reciting Initium Sancti Evangelii, and so on, the gospel according to John. Suddenly, Françoise falls to the floor. This is the compressed version, cut out a bunch here. She spreads her arms out in the form of a crucifix. She seems to float horizontally across the courtroom on her back. She inverts vertically. They're terrified. They run. They slam the door. Her feet start battering against the door. Night falls and things soon get even weirder. Morel makes his way back into the I almost said classroom, witchcraft. The candles suddenly go out. It's pitch black, and Morel is alone and crying out in the darkness, "My God, grant me grace." No answer. So he tries, "Devil, I command you that by the power that I have as judge." Well, it turns out that conjuring the devil when you're alone in the dark turns out to be a bad idea. There's a violent blow, cuts him across the cheek. He swings his sword wildly around in the darkness, but the devil jumps on his back and takes him by his lower legs and starts beating him. And at last, help arrives with torches. The light spreads across the floor. There's blood everywhere. Both Françoise and Morel are wounded, but they're more or less in one piece, and they're mostly dazed. Now, from the distance of 400 or so years, the scene appears kind of farcical. There are blows and swords flying around randomly in the darkness, and robed officials grabbing arms and legs and jumping on one another's backs, but no one actually dies. But for the participants, it clearly signifies a deadly battle with the devil, where the demonic has invaded the space of law, the judge has lost control of his courtroom, and it's not clear who's going to win. So you have to read the book to find out what happens to Françoise, or maybe Julie will tell us. Or if not, then you'll pry it out of us in the Q&A. But I wanted to tell you the story, not just because it's mildly amusing, but also because it speaks to the book's central arguments and to my historical method generally. When we picture European witch trials, we usually picture the worst moments of mass hysteria: torture, terrifyingly swift judicial machinery, massive death toll, and all of that was out there in the worst witch hunts. So I don't make light of that or minimize it, but it does make it easy to forget that executions for witchcraft were pretty rare. And a lot of the accused were actually acquitted, in part because so many people were like Morel, skeptics. That's why almost every demonological treatise starts, more or less, "I am writing this treatise because the evil skeptics allow witches to roam free and multiply to the ruin of Christendom." So that's why witch hunting judges and accusers felt that they had to prove the skeptics wrong by showing them witchcraft performed in the courtroom before their very eyes. So through various means, they managed to get the accused to conjure the devil or the devil's familiars, create hailstorms, turn themselves into wolves. They bring the witch into the courtroom and show the witch, causing the bewitched to thrash around wildly and speak in demonic voices or vomit hair, straw, and nails. They were very good at that. That is, they basically make the invisible world visible. So I offer a somewhat counterintuitive answer to the question we all ask, which is really, how could this have happened? Just something like the question we asked on November 5th, but we'll leave that aside. So the questions we asked more specifically are, how could so many people have believed the world was swarming with witches? How could over 50,000 people have been tortured and judicially murdered? And there are lots of answers, but one of them is skepticism. Skepticism enraged true believers, inciting them to write demonological treatises that spread fear of witches through Europe and the New World. And it essentially produced a demand for visible proof that turned unbelievers into believers. So what I came to see as I was reading these thousands of demonological treatises and pamphlets and looking at images is that the staging of witchcraft wasn't just, I'll show you. There were actually 3 formal doctrines of full proof, that is, proof that meant no need for more evidence, you're guilty. And that the staging essentially answered to these kinds of proof. And very briefly, I can say more in the Q&A. These are, first, catching the criminal in the act, we're all familiar with this from our childhood or children, establishing notorious fact of guilt and producing violent presumptions of guilt, what they called indicia indubitata, that is, signs that you cannot doubt, which always presupposes that there are doubters and they need signs in order not to doubt. So I talk about the specific forms of staging that served as these full kinds of proof, but, and this is where I come back to Françoise, staging could escape control and go completely haywire, producing unintended effects with unexpected symbolic resonance. And so in some ways, I give a schematic idea of how staging served proof, and then I say, but things go wild, and each event is its own event with its own set of resonances and meanings. So, as some of you know, this mini book, which I'm still determined to call a book, is an offshoot of its much fatter predecessor, Law's Performance. And the central argument of that book in a nutshell is that when we focus on legal doctrines and texts, that's basically what traditional legal history does, doctrines, texts, we miss a lot of what really happens in trials or other kinds of legal events, which is 3D sensory experience, time, space, movement. These aren't just present, they're present, but they're also expressive. They express things, and in this, they actually make law effectively. So, and there's actually a large body of ancient through early modern jurisprudential thought that knew this and debated the use and abuse of legal performance. It's essentially a body of thought that I realized legal history had kind of forgotten, and part of my goal in Law's Performance was to say, this is out there and this was really important and we should think about it ourselves for our own law. But okay, so in a way, what Law's Performance lays out pretty systematically is the premise of this tiny but very significant book. But this one is also really different in some obvious ways. For instance, it deals with around 40 years instead of about 2,000 years of legal history. As some of you know from my last Haven Center thing, you know, Law's Performance is the book that started as an introduction and got completely out of control. I guess like a witch trial. Anyway, but there are some less obvious ways that these books are different. One is Staging Witchcraft offers two close readings, including the reading of Françoise's trial, that I hope can serve as kind of models for close reading historical events with methodologies that I think are transferable to other kinds of events, both historical and contemporary, for reading events, not just for their microhistory, social history, mentalité, but for thinking about what happens on the ground in time and space and so on. And another is that I hope it's not just a contribution to the early modern history of evidence, but to the theory of evidence more broadly. So we all tend to think of evidence, legal evidence particularly, as a set of propositions that may or may not be credible. And when scholars of evidence usually do, especially philosophers, you know, they have a whole lot of criteria about what makes things credible and what doesn't make things credible and so on. But evidence is in fact sensory, kinesthetic, affective, narrative. It speaks to the senses and emotions. It's not static, but in motion, and it emerges in time in something of the way that narratives do. So the books are really different, but both are, in a sense, prologues to my current project, because they're essentially, I think of them as prehistories of our present legal moment of performance, and performance is, of course, a medium, performance and media in our present moment. So my current project is about what our culture of cameras and screens has done to law, how it renders law a spectacle, how it demands that people perform before the eye of the camera, in a traffic stop, in confession, in a police chamber, in trials, obviously. It's really about how cameras and screens are both instruments of law and documentary mirrors that effectively reflect law back to itself and to us as law unfolds. Thank you.
As I hinted earlier, I'm talking about the same story that Julie began with, but luckily it's a different story. And I'm just here to say that I'm sort of guessing that many of the people in this room are here for the witches. And what I'm sort of hailing in this conversation is sort of an older story. We might call it a trans-historical feminist, radical feminist argument about witchcraft. And that's what I'm honing in on today because the times demand it. Because I have only a few moments and I have much to say about this remarkable little book, banish shame about its size, I'm going to head into what I see as the most stunning few pages of the book, page 36 to 46 to be exact, if anybody has it. Julie's account of a little study of French trial in which the 22-year-old servant named Françoise Fontaine was accused of being a witch. For those of you who haven't read it, a few crucial details, some of which, but not all, Julie just told us. It's 1591. A family is living in a home that's haunted. The new maid, who has been acting strangely, you understand already it's a parable for our times, is arrested. In the courtroom, that theater of evidentiary performance, Francois performs what Julie helpfully identifies via Louise Chubb as the theatergrams of demonic possession. She thrashes about, will say it again to make her a spectacle again. Her eyes roll back, she levitates, her hair stands on end. Yet the magistrate judging her is skeptical. Skepticism, as Julie shows, is paradoxically what drives the pursuit and the performance of proof, as well as the punishment of witches. And his skepticism invites further display of what Julie also helpfully calls the choreography of possession. Françoise turns upside down. She falls as if from a great height. It's a transcript of my own life right now. Falls into the depths of an imaginary well. She tells the court another dominant witchcraft script, that she has had sex repeatedly, including in prison with the devil. And she gave him a lock of her hair to twist about his finger. A pact with the devil is the queen of proofs in witch trials. Yet her confession begins with a different account. An account of 3 soldiers who accosted her late one night and told her if they didn't let her have their way with her, they would take her to the military guardhouse where she would be raped by more than 300 soldiers. As the transcript recounts, she abandoned herself to them, and she awakes the next morning in despair, believing that she had been, quote, given to the devil. The trial continues, as Julie said, in its harrowing pitch. She is beaten with a broom. The magistrates plan a surprise attack on her that Julie already recounted, in which they cover their faces with their cloaks and only their eyes are showing. Eventually, she levitates and her body takes the form of a cross, her arms spread out on either side of her body, and she shoots projectile-like towards her accusers, falling at the foot. This final form is an emblem of the forces levied against her: judicial, political, religious, taking what Julie calls a tripartite form: Christ on the cross, the seated judge, the prone woman. In the culmination of the scene, it's almost too much to bear. The magistrates command a barber to shave her. But when he goes on to move from her underarms to her, quote, shameful parts, something miraculous happens. This is Julie writing here, I'm quoting her. She says no. And unlike the soldiers or the devils, they stop. She, Françoise, renounced the evil spirit, and with that double refusal of the devil and of those who would violate her, she is at once cured and deemed innocent. The trial is over. Yet, as Julie notes, a huge mass of her hair, a monstrous growth of that single strand she gave to the devil, remains stuck, you can't make this up, remains stuck in the plasterwork of the jail cell, undig-outable by tools or by fingers digging, quote, 3 fingers deep and trying to pull it out. Now we're in, obviously, a parable of a different kind. The hair, Julie argues, exceeds the law's grasp, and it still haunts, even subtends the foundations of the courtroom, the whole apparatus of the law, and absolutely no one can pry it loose. I'm looking at some people in the room who know where I'm going next. The story is uncannily like the plot of Aeschylus's Eumenides, when the law, which we are told is always for the man, deeming the true parent he who mounts, buries the specter of women's abuse and murder, their vengeance and their rage, under the very edifice of the law itself in the center of Athens, the Parthenon, the citadel of the law, turning the furies of women's rage into a genteelly decorous ritual cult of appeasement. For those who haven't read the Aeschylus recently, it makes for great timely reading. But the story is also the political and conscious of the relationship between rape, witchcraft, and the law that haunts our own legal institution, the Supreme Court, which is also the burial site of certain forms of women's suffering and rage. I'm totally the humorous radical feminist today, I realize that. I'll smile and make it better. It's a far too little known fact that the draft Justice Alito wrote supporting the ultimately successful overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2022. Some of you know it, I see you nodding. He cited the most famous witch trial judge of the 17th century, Sir Matthew Hale, 8 times. I just like to let that one sink in. Hale argued that men cannot be prosecuted for raping their wives. He is responsible, I'm citing ProPublica here, yay ProPublica, for the longest lasting and tenacious legal precedent that jurors ought to be skeptical of accusations of rape, which are, he writes, easy to be made and hard to be proven and harder to be defended by the party accused, though ever so innocent. Hale, the witch finder, established a central tenet of his legal philosophy that giving women legal rights over their own bodies was a threat to men's freedom. Thus, when Alito cites Hale as one of the eminent common law authorities of history, who show that historically abortion was seen not as a right, but as a criminal act, his authority rests equally on the grounds of a larger anti-feminist project and a far longer durée of misogyny, rape denial, and witchcraft persecution. Hale personally oversaw the execution of at least 5 women. I can't get out of here without ending with a quotation from Pat Robertson from an anti-ERA speech he gave in 1992. Other people are laughing and know where I'm going now as well. 400 years after Françoise's ordeal and 1 year before marital rape finally became illegal in all 50 states. That was in 1993. It became illegal in the UK in 1991. Feminism, he intoned on words that would be printed on many a canvas bag, including that carried by my 15-year-old daughter, is, quote, a socialist, anti-family political movement that encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians.
It's dangerous you call yourself humorless because I'm not going to be able to get a laugh like that. But I feel so honored and happy to be invited to be part of this panel. We were talking about how we feel slightly like we're pretending, but there's a lot of pretending in the book as well. So I feel on topic. I wanted to talk about when I was reading Julie's magnificent little book. I think littler is better. A couple of the things that stood out to me and that I wanted to think about. One was just she really captured how much of a show it is, and that either the courtroom is full. Sometimes there's scenes where people are looking in the windows. I mean, it's a very popular show, and along those lines, there's a question of why is this show very popular? As Julie was saying, there are the trials we're not watching and the trials that aren't happening. There's no trial for the 3 soldiers who rape Françoise, and there might not be any interest in the trial even if it did happen. So I kind of also kind of haunted by the present moment, was thinking about this in terms of the other point that really stood out to me in Julie's book, which was this idea that sometimes that the skeptics were in some way almost writing the law that was sort of oppressing these women. And what is that, how does that affect the way we think about resistance? Like when something that is intended as resistance ends up reinforcing something or almost being a buttress for something. And I was thinking about this in particular last year when the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, basically came to campus for a photo op, right? He came to campus to show this backdrop that he was going to work for his argument that something terrifying was happening on campus and he was standing up against it. So the show was co-written, and there's a sense of like, who's getting in control of it. So I wanted to think about the question with these trials and as it comes into the present moment. What is the show? Why is it so popular? Who's writing it? Who's working on it? Who's watching it? And who's acting in it? Part of what's quite moving in Julie's book is she makes it so vivid that some of these people, like there was a young boy who sort of was a teenaged werewolf and sort of eating children. And how clearly exciting and thrilling it was for this child to be a superstar. And in fact, when people were saying maybe this isn't really happening, he had to sort of wrest the attention back at the expense of his own life. And so I wanted to think it's almost like there's a writer's room that people don't realize they're in. Another really kind of haunting moment in the case that Julie and Julie both spoke about is the judge himself becomes, is trying to control the courtroom, but also is sort of writing this idea of what witchcraft is, and is haunted by this idea that he starts, chanting these sort of traits to get other people to chant it. There's a moment in one of the trials where the judge is saying, I am a witch and this and that, but trying to get the person to participate in the trial, basically giving them cues for the scripts. And this all brought me back to in a sense, like a happier moment. My first encounter with witches, right, was when I was a young child and watched TV, unfortunately, like 7 or 8 hours a day, which happens if you're raised in Oklahoma. So I just mentioned every morning at 7:05 a.m. there was like a repeat of I Dream of Jeannie, and after that at 7:35 a.m. there was a repeat of Bewitched. Now these shows were absolutely mesmerizing to me, of course, because they had these beautiful women who were very powerful, and it kind of freaked out their husbands. But at the same time, the shows were mollifying, right? It somehow was a collective narrative. I mean, obviously the show had writers, but the culture wrote a show about incredibly powerful women eager to serve and submit a deliberately doofy man. Like in both shows, in fact, Darren in the second show is so doofy that there's a series of Darrens and you don't even notice. They keep just changing the actor. And it's kind of anyway, so that was a happier moment, actually, in a funny way. That used to seem to me like a dark past, and now it seems like a kind of brighter moment in the past. But that was really what I wanted to think about, was this idea of this collective writing, that it's written both within the courtroom, it's written by the accused. They feel overwhelmed to participate in the story they're told is true. It's written by even the skeptical judges. It's written by the non-skeptical judges. It's written by the audience who has decided that this is a fantastic show and that there are other shows in town that aren't so interesting. So that's what I was thinking about.
I promise to make it quick because I'm last. Yeah. Oh, making me do that. Okay. So it is great to be here. Thank you. I traveled up from Philadelphia and walked around the Columbia campus for about 90 minutes to find this place. I don't know how you can stand it. Oh, anyway, I'm delighted to be here, and I so enjoyed the book. It packs a wallop in 58 pages of text, and it's riveting. And I am not an expert in anything that's relevant here, not early modern law or performance theory or magic or even witchcraft. I truly am the imposter. So I'm approaching these comments with a sense of limitations and being an outsider. I am trained in law and history and religion, and I'll try to use those tools this evening. So first, I've long admired Julie's work in law and theater and the ways that they are flip sides of the same coin, and building out on that theory. And this is, I'm sort of picking up which is nice that you see this as well, on how much law and magic inform each other in this book, much as law and theater informed each other in the previous one, and how the movements and symptoms associated with magic or witchcraft, and I'm never quite clear which is what where. And that's one thing I wanted to follow up on. But the ways that all of those are closely linked to rules of evidence. And that's evidence is always tactile, right? It's always in your face, loud spoken. It can be movements, it can be documents, but it's right in front of you. And so we also see these fascinating exchanges between judges and accused witnesses, creating relationships. I mean, I think there's a relationship with the judge that's fraught, but it's also potentially productive, right? So it's interesting to see them spend time together. The intensity of their interaction seems like a subplot with tension and dynamism that are consistent with trials, because they're always tense and dynamic too. So I was struck by the relative density of witchcraft trials and associated events in the 16th and 17th century. And that raises questions for me. Why is this particularly dense? I wonder whether the religious wars are a background element to these cases, because they seem to frequently involve fights between neighbors, employees, and employers, disagreements over what counts as spiritual possession and what the consequences should be. So I'm thinking like of the work of Natalie Zeman Davis about how neighbors become strangers to each other as they battle over religion. And so I think skepticism is tied to very, very big moments of religious change and reorientation. So it's interesting to see whether maybe these litigants come from places that are particularly disturbed by such religious unrest. And I promise I'm almost done. Another aspect of a question about religion is the shifting relationship in what counts as faith and worship on the one hand, and what looks like more like witchcraft and devilish possession on the other. And you, Julie, you do such a great job of analyzing the role of extended arms in a crucifix style gesture. And I think these cases are just rich with that kind of symbolism. You don't have time, I know, or space to do all of it. A Cambridge element is just a disciplinary, you know, it's like an Iron Maiden, right? It's one of those. But if I were to continue in this line of thought, I would just think about the ways that trials aren't only rich with theatrical elements, but also with ritual meaning. When I was in law school, I was the head of the moot court for my school, and I had to buy new robes for our judges. And I realized that's also the place where you get the waterproof baptismal undergarments. Literally, the robes are the same for priests and judges. It's just so obvious. And the constant stress by the judges that they defend God or maybe even have been appointed by God, or maybe a kind of our God. And they're repeated, ceremonial, and truly catechistic. I mean, they're catechizing these litigants and witnesses, right? They have an aura of ritual, especially evident in cases involving curses, carnal knowledge, diabolical violence, rape and seduction, and more. These are all sins, every single one of them. And judges struggle with guilt and redemption and forgiveness and cleansing like priests do. And they're all tied to judgment in both senses of the term, religious and judicial. So a final point I just want to make about trials, and we've been talking about how riveting these are, is that trials often are really boring because they move so slowly, day after day, week after week. And I think Morel spent way too much time on this one trial, way too much time. They unfold, every trial unfolds in unpredictable ways. It's always what happens. The dullness of most of a trial is notable because they're trying to control it and they never quite can. The repetition, the slow-mo movement, the sort of tendentiousness of judicial soliloquies, all of that is self-aggrandizing and trying to retain control. So that skepticism is all about being judgy and claiming power. So the hidden nature of the crime, like many crimes, witchcraft, make conviction elusive, putting the judge back on their heels right when they start a case like this, making them cautious, and accusers positively relentless. These people were diabolical. They took every moment they possibly could to embarrass the person in the dock. And I'm actually going to mention the Throckmortons, which nobody has yet, spring to mind, putting on shows nonstop. Theirs was an uphill climb, but they made it, right, by repeating themselves endlessly and recreating the harm, which is a common element in word crimes, right? Like slander, many kinds of online stalking, and more, including many crimes of assault, assaulting someone. The fascinating contemporary versions of magic and witchcraft crimes include profanity, pornography, conspiracy, sedition, hate speech and hate crimes, and more. Their religious counterparts include heresy, blasphemy, calumny, desecration, and more, right? So the prosecution of witches may seem centuries behind us, and everybody's had a contemporary element, and I want to give one, which relates to Santeria and Voodoo practitioners who really are very obvious here, and always women. I'm thinking of the Church of Lukumi Babalu Ai versus the city of Hialeah, a Supreme Court case, and prosecutions for murder as recently as 2020 of Haitian women. And so I think that, putting it comfortably in the past just isn't possible, both in the ways that you all talked about and maybe in actual federal and state prosecutions as well. Thanks so much.
All right. Wow, that was great. And I think the only thing was missing was these three talking about their own amazing work. And when Sally says that she's not an expert, she's one of the major legal historians, former president of the American Society for Legal History, and knows religion and what is else, what is this but religion? Okay. I think, whenever we write a book, we leave a lot of stuff out. Your framing is always what you're leaving out. So I guess maybe my response will take the form of my painful consciousness of some of the things that I left out that were marked in the comments. The first, just to start with Sally's point about law being boring. I do in the introduction to law's performance, I do say that
Yeah.
law is mostly boring. It takes forever. Although early modern law was less boring because trials were so fast, 15 minutes, 20 minutes sometimes. You don't stand much of a chance if the judge has already decided what they want, or the jury in England. So in some ways, this is a bigger historiographic question that has to do with the fact that I pay a lot of attention to the exceptional rather than what somebody in the recent Heyman seminar called the exceptionally normal. The exceptionally normal is a very, very useful way of telling stories about history, but I think paying attention to the exceptional, and these cases are exceptional, is paying attention to things that are symptomatic, that reveal things about culture that we don't see in the exceptionally normal. And it's part of, and I think a lot of the cases in both of these books that I pay attention to are ways of capturing how law, even when it's quiet, they capture sort of writ large what law does even when it's quiet. We may not notice all the kind of symbolic effects and sensory effects and kinesthetic effects in ordinary, boring, dull law. They're there, they're just more quietly there. So it's a way of calling attention to things that aren't noticeable except in the exceptional moment. Okay, so in some way, so I leave out the normal, the exceptionally normal especially. I think I also, the other thing that I bracketed was the kind of conventional history that people who write books on the witch trials write. I was very conscious of not just not wanting to write just another book that says, I'm going to explain the witch trials to you, and I have the correct explanation this time. It wasn't religious wars. It wasn't, neighborly feuds. It wasn't gender hatred. I think it was all those things, by the way. It was, so I don't want to do that. And in some ways that means that I bracketed a lot of the historical context. I focus on 1580 to 1620 in part because that was the height of the trials, and I really wanted to capture it at its height. And I felt like it was a little cheating if I went later in the 17th century when trials were so even more conventionally spectacular. You all probably know this from the Salem witch trials, which were very much learned from the pamphlets describing the earlier European witch trials. So I don't talk about the religious wars, which were really important. I don't talk about, field enclosures, which were really important. I don't talk about vagabondage and women and impoverished women who seemed like a burden on the community, which was very important. And I don't talk about some of the gender things, and I'm going to get to that in a minute, that Julie called, the true Julie calls attention to. The other thing, listening to Rivka, I suddenly had a temptation that I'm going to suppress, which is to write a kind of more popular book with the fuller stories of these people. There are a lot of stories in this very small book, but I feel as if I could really tell a much longer story of Jean the werewolf, the boy werewolf, and partly because those stories help us understand. So one of the questions that anybody in the audience might have is, how did the judges and accusers get the accused to perform this witchcraft? And a couple of answers are things like, if you're tortured, or if you're left in a prison that is effectively torture, you're just desperate to end things and you do what the judge tells you to do. Another answer is the celebrity of the young boy. I think that was very important. Another answer is some of the accused really believed that they were witches. Some of them probably practiced witchcraft. Some of them also had a certain amount of confusion and came to believe what they were told. There are a lot of other cases in my book where it's clear that they're being trapped into doing something that they didn't realize was going to get them convicted. So lots of answers to that. But so I'm tempted to write the book about the personal stories. Who knows? Maybe. Depends how many books I have left in me. Okay. A bigger historiographic question that actually speaks to some of the things that Julie says. I think that Julie perfectly diagnosed what I know is a historiographic overcorrection in my work. I tend to think, there are kind of two kinds of legal history that people do. There's, liberal, happy, progressive legal history. We've gotten kinder and more humane, and law has gotten better, and we're all getting to it, et cetera, et cetera. Probably most people in this room don't really believe that story. The form that we're more familiar with is sort of critical legal history. Legal history is a series of disasters and atrocities, which in many ways it is. But I often feel that kind of, and leading to mass incarceration, et cetera, and all of that may be true, but I often feel that kind of history is somewhat denigrating to its subjects, because it tends to treat them as this victimized mass without sort of relating to the individuals who are experiencing things who are sometimes incredibly funny and in your face and talk back to law. And so I know I overcorrect in both of these books by often focusing on stories where the one in Lost Performance that everyone remembers is the woman who turned her back to the judge and mooned him. An excellent moment. There were many historical examples where this actually happened. So my historiography in some ways brackets the tragedies, and the fact that I didn't talk about Françoise's rape when Julie did, I think it is symptomatic. It's very much part of the book, and it's very much what I have. It's key to what I have to say about the case, and but I think I cast it. She is clearly tortured and a victim. But I also like to see the women as coming out victorious on top. And I cast it as her performance as somehow a challenge to ideas about consent that are essential to conviction for witchcraft. Did you consent to the devil or not? Well, actually, let me tell you, says Françoise in her rape story, consent is not what you think it is. Yes, says Françoise, I gave myself to those men. They told me that I'd be raped by 300 other soldiers if I didn't, and I was terrified. Oh, you consented. No, and that's not what the judges say. But nevertheless, that's an old story that we know. So that's just to say, that's to pick up on what Rivka said about Bewitched. I like powerful women who freak out the men, and I write about them as often as I can. I think the other thing which Sally really brought out in her remarks are two pieces that are one piece is part of the book and one not so much. The end of the title of the book is Law as Magic, and in my original so the book is very much about how law often functions as this kind of conjuring, certainly in the early modern period. And Rivka mentioned the moment when, or maybe it was Sally, I'm not sure, when in the other case that I look at in depth, the judge is just desperate to get a confession out of the alleged male witch in the dock. And he wants him to recite a charm that says, as I am a witch, I killed Lady Cromwell, and so on. And the guy won't say it. The accused won't say it. So the judge says, I'm going to say it for you to help you out. And the judge says, as I am a witch, I killed Lady Cromwell. He still won't say it. So eventually the judge gets all these upright men in the room to say it together, chanting together, as I am a witch. And it's basically like a witch's Sabbath with this whole inversion. Anyway, law is magic. It often is. My original epilogue, or whatever it was, conclusion to the book, had a lot about how law is still magic today. And it did talk about some of these recent witchcraft cases, and the reader's report said get rid of it, and I complied, which maybe I shouldn't have. But I'm very interested in what this means both for witchcraft cases today, the many witchcraft cases that are out there, and generally for how we think about law and what it does to women and violence and many other things.
We have time for questions from the audience.
Are there any witches?
Oh, yes, excellent.
Oh,
Hi, everybody. Witch here. This is a question for all panelists to ruminate, but specifically in regards to the parallels that Sarah was making between law and religion. And I was just thinking about a lot of those parallels and how this blame that was put on women being accused of witches wasn't necessarily about them, but just the power move that was being made by men to conjure a common enemy, and how today it's hard not to see this like turning strangers or turning neighbors into strangers religiously back then, and how that's happening with politics now. And I guess the question is, what would we consider today's modern day witches by those parallels? Like, who are we making the bad guy in favor of creating like a common enemy, I guess? And like, just given everything that's happening right now, I mean, immigration comes to mind right away, but are there any other parallels that we can think of in that regard?
I'm jumping in here just so I can, because I'm not sure it will, but maybe it will address something of what you're asking there. Julie maybe will address the gender question, but I'm actually thinking about policing, because I'm thinking about how forced performance that actually turns into a trap. And it's part of what I'm writing about now, because I've watched thousands of YouTube videos, et cetera, where violent policing forces defense that in the mirror of the camera actually looks like violence that justifies police officers in slapping on a what they call RDO. I always forget what RDO stands for, but basically it's you know, resisting and obstructing. No, resisting and obstructing is in there. So essentially there are certain moves, and you see them again and again, that get people, when people put their hands up, for instance, and that becomes cast in front of judges as evidence that they were in fact resisting. And there are all kinds of awful consequences that come with that, because sometimes you can pay a fine, sometimes you can't pay a fine. You're forced by plea bargaining to plead guilty. Then you have a guilty plea on your record. Then if you've been caught twice, it often turns into a felony. So it expands and expands, and it effectively often can become a capital sentence in some ways. You spend your life in jail because of that, because of those assaults. So that's my example.
I have a question about evidence and religion, because in listening to you talk about how they keep wanting to make the witchcraft manifest, and it's a response to skepticism, so it's also about faith. I kept thinking about much earlier texts that I'm familiar with, like Augustine in City of God, talking about miracles. Oh, you have to go see this and you go see that, and then you know, because there's that tension between pure faith and wanting to ground something in a performance that makes things manifest. So that made me start wondering about what's going on with miracles at this time. Has all the energy that had been devoted to miracles that showed that Christ existed and was resurrected and had power, had it gone over to the other side, and instead what needed to be made manifest was the devil? Or I mean, this might be outside everybody's remit, because everybody's like more of a witch expert, monster expert. I'm there for that. But I'm curious about what the discourse around miracles was in this period. It seems to me it's not as strong in this era as it was in the moment of early Christianity.
This is your question.
Avec.
I mean, the age of miracles is over. And so, you know, like if the long history of this period, religion and the decline of magic, sort of arguments about then, okay, so how do you make God manifest if the age of miracles is past? And one way is through these disciplinary regimes. So you have, I mean, you have James the First, who made his argument that he manifested the divine right of kings because he kept claiming and proving that witches were trying to kill him. Because what other way to prove that you were God's servant on earth than the witches are trying to kill you, right? So
And
he was
can't.
and can't. So he was, but he was a big persecutor of witches, both in Scotland and in England, as a way of shoring up the logic of the divine right of kings. But yeah, I mean, you know, where do you see it manifest when the age of miracles is over and most of the rituals of the Catholic Church for the Protestants are deemed hocus pocus superstition, right? And one argument that people make is that you see it manifest in other kinds of miraculous bodies, monsters, witches, right? Women who kill. Sounds familiar, right? I mean, so to go back to your question, like, it's not a coincidence that, I mean, obviously the real witch trial was Donald Trump's witch trial, as he kept saying, it's a witch trial.
God.
But, you know, I mean, the obvious case that we would go to, it's the most abundantly obvious case, all the obvious cases now, but the dominant one is the attack on trans people. Right? It has to do with what I was saying before about men's freedom, but it also has to do with like where you locate threatening bodies that are somehow anti all the things, but one of the things is anti God's plan.
Right. And I will say, to add to the supplement and also connect to today, one of the things that really surprised me was how much of the true believers literature was insisted on empirical evidence. So we tend to think of empiricism as, you know, enlightenment, but actually, you know, Doubting Thomas is a big figure. And what they say, the moral of Doubting Thomas, weirdly, in a lot of this literature isn't, you know, you just have to have faith. It's that Jesus said, touch and feel and believe. You have to really see and touch and feel, and I will show you. And on the other side, many of the skeptics have arguments from faith and from religious history. The church was really against witch hunts from way back. The church, it changed, but in the earlier period, there was a claim that it was the devil. It was the devil doing all this stuff. It wasn't witches, so you shouldn't prosecute witches. And that disappeared in many places in the period. But I guess the thing that I was going to say today is that some of these fundamentalist arguments also, they draw on empirical, they seem to draw on the language of science that we think of as part of the 21st century, while taking us back to the Middle Ages, which, as Julie points out, he said, you know, Dobbs doesn't just cite Matthew Hale, it also cites all these medieval laws.
Thanks. I was wondering, in answer to the earlier question, if we could talk about the word hoax, which I know comes from hokum and hex and so forth. And I was thinking specifically about the entire vaccine, well, the anti-vaccine movement in this regard, because of course that projects the hoax onto science and inoculation and so forth. But what I find so interesting, especially given the committee hearings we've been hearing from RFK Jr. and so forth, is that it actually presupposes a kind of supernatural immunity on the part of everyone else, which is to say we don't need science because we have been tricked into believing by these witch-like others that we are prone to illness, when in fact we have this sort of superhuman immunity if only we used it. And there's the so-called Maha movement, which is all about making America healthy again by getting rid of all modern medicine, some of which involves home remedies and what used to be called old wives' tales, which have great value, but mixed with a lot of nonsense too. So what occurs to me is that there's a kind of self-witchification in that. It's a sort of embrace of a supernatural immunity against these nefarious others, these devil-like others. And it's it's so successful. I confess to following it rather maniacally, because this is something I'm very interested in. But I'm wondering if you've been thinking about contemporary medical debates in the context of politics right now and witchcraft. Sorry if that was too long.
I how could I say anything more eloquent than that? Yes, no, I haven't been following it, but I now want to.
Something, there we go. Thank you. So this is all really, really great and interesting. And I also can't stay out of the present moment. It's just inevitable. You mentioned the most persecuted person in history. And, you know, I was thinking about this issue of like this weird flipping of persecution as a way of making all this happen. And so I just want to put in a plug for Rivka's amazing book, Everyone Knows Your Mother's Witch. It's so good. And in it, you know, many of the members of the community, the neighbors, feel that they're being persecuted, you know, and somebody did this to the girl on her way home, and this happened to his leg, and you know, they're suffering from ailments that come from living in, you know, medieval Northern Europe, and but they experience it as persecution. And, you know, haven't read your marvelous 58-page book yet, but the fact that it's short does make it more likely to be on the nightstand soon. But anyway, but so I don't know if this is germane to the way you're thinking about these particular trials, but I was really thinking about that, this kind of weird passing around of the concept of persecution. And then of course it lands where it lands, you know, with these primarily women and so on. But in your story, Julie, and you're kind of, you know, pushing back on some things, but wanting to think about agency, you know, there's a little bit more maybe return or fluidity in some of that. So I don't know if this is really a question or an observation, but I'd be curious to know if you were thinking about some of these ways in which and maybe this is sort of connected to the skepticism weirdly breeds the legal, you know, persecution of witches, but this question of persecution being something that is foundational to the people who then need to go and deal with the witches. So maybe that's too presentist, but it's a question-ish.
Yes, yes, definitely. Now I'm just trying to get my mind. Yes. So if you read the demonological treatises, some of which were written by judges who did see to the and brag in their, you know, I was responsible for the execution of 272 witches. They do feel persecuted. They just like our most persecuted, and they're in positions of incredible power, and they feel that the witches are persecuting them, and the witches are also going to unseat them. I think that's part of the real fear too. Again, I don't give as much attention to the ones who were very successful. Well, I quote from their treatises, but like Pierre de l'Ancre, I give more attention to a guy named Richard Gallus, who, again, it's these doofus men who fail, whom I love, who's certain that these witches in Windsor are persecuting him. And he's so angry, and he can't get the magistrates to prosecute them. So he decides to do it himself, and he drags them out of their house. Eventually he totally fails. But I think it's the same mentality as that of the people who actually were successful.
Hi, Julie. I wanted to ask a question about, I guess a lot of the literature on witchcraft and anthropology focuses on the force of accusation as a form of contagion, as a sort of insatiable thing that reproduces itself sort of indefinitely until it peters out. There's sort of a question about what are the dynamics of ebb and flow, of swell and release. And I guess my question is, right, these guys writing the demonological treatises say 200 witches, 230 witches. Are there, is there anything in this amazing close examination of the trials and the way that performance is working that reveals something about the dynamics of how the accusation moves, why it can't be satisfied, even by a conviction?
I really like that. The need can't be satisfied even by a conviction. I think because I don't really focus on the epidemics. I focus more on individual cases because I'm looking at, how performance works. So I'm isolating them in some ways from their context. But I'm very aware of what you say, of this feeling, I guess, with the Throckmorton children, which Sally or one of you, Sally, mentioned. There it certainly is contagion. It starts out with one girl in this household who's sick. I think she's 10 years old. I'm forgetting which one is first. And it spreads to the servants and her sisters, and essentially the Throckmorton children, they get incredible freedom through their accusations in all kinds of ways. From a really oppressive household scene, they're liberated and they can act out whenever they want. There's another boy, I can't remember if he made it into the final version, who also just doesn't want to go to school, so he becomes bewitched, and he doesn't. And whenever he's told that he has to go to school, he screams, the witch is attacking him. But I think there's something beyond sort of self-interested desire for freedom that is contagious, that we, I think we don't have to just look around at this terrifying world that is rising up before us. We probably also have to look at ourselves and our own vulnerability to contagion and watch ourselves.
Hi, thank you. It's a bit in that direction, I think, but I would like to inquire a bit more about the triangular relationship between truth, spectators as a medium for truth, and evidence. So today we would say we are more in like a dispositive of what the public is in the courtroom, but it's not a constitutive spectatorship. You're just following the anchor of truth. But back then it was more of like an ordeal that has to be produced right in front of the people. So how much do you look into the spectators in the courtroom as a necessary medium of evidence and therefore of truth?
I think you're absolutely right. They are huge. I love that idea of the triangular relationship and the spectators as medium. I don't talk about that nearly as much in this as in Law's Performance, where I talk a lot about spectatorship and spectators as a medium. It's certainly true that in these very short, very condensed trials with a community that's very connected to itself, that becomes a very important form of, we think of the Salem witch trials. Watching those spectacles, people were captured by it and reflected it back to the law. I actually think that today it is really important, and I don't think it's just, I don't think it happens just in the courtroom. It happens because, it happens on the screen, and it happens in the comments on the screen, and it happens in news and counter news. So spectatorship seems to me an incredibly important medium for law today, maybe more important than ever, but in some ways a very confusing one, in part because of our embattled era, and in part because the multiplicity of media for spectators to express themselves. I feel like I should have some definitive statement to close that up, but I don't. But I feel like I'm doing all the talking in my way.
Yeah, last question.
Hello. I can hear myself. It's weird. I'm going to keep it away from my mouth a little bit. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about how the field of law itself is circumscribed by belief. rationality is sort of part of the rhetoric of law, but law itself is not necessarily in any way homologous with reason. And since Julie Crawford brought up the Oresteia, I mean, law is gathered together by God. I wonder to what extent we could talk about, even in contemporary law, sort of skeptics and believers of law within law. There are people who buy into it all the way, and there are people who don't believe in it at all, and they're both operative within the field of law.
I feel like maybe this is a question for psychology.
That's a complicated question and a really good one. The second person you're talking about who participates but doesn't believe is called the bad man of the law. You really have to sweat. You really need to take the Kool-Aid to be good, right? That's how that rule kind of works. I was thinking earlier when Julie was talking about evidence. There's a really interesting book, one of the first books on evidence published in the United States, that argued that the rules of the common law had proven the truth of the New Testament. And it sold a lot of books. So the notion that there's sort of this sharp distinction between law and religion, just it's not a comfortable notion. It doesn't hold up well to sort of sustained gazes across time and across space, especially in our country, among developed nations. It's particularly tactile here, the connection. And I would say that just as a historian of church and state, the government hands out benefits, like phenomenal benefits, and has since 1780 to religious groups and individuals. So there's a tight relationship, and it has been tight for a long time. And I think it's just as true in law. And you can see first year of law school, there's this description of people, and about week 6, they start sliding down the slippery throat of the law and learning the language and learning how to think that way, and taking a problem and going right, and feeling the power of being able to do that. It's a very similar sense. It's a great question. And the guy who doesn't buy it is the bad man. Just remember that.
Do you want to have any closing remarks before?
I don't know. I feel like those are the closing remarks.